joining us today at City Club's May 6th Friday Forum. I'm Sharon Van Sickle Robbins, President of City Club, and I would like to welcome you all, those of you here with us today at the Governor Hotel, and those of you listening on OPB or KBPS radio, or watching on Portland Community Media's CityNet 30. Today, Speaker Elizabeth Harchenko will discuss how we find the sweet spot that balances how we pay for public services with the quantity of services we want and need. But first, a few announcements. To begin with, if you haven't already done so, could you please silence your cell phones? Next, I'd like to recognize a couple of our new City Club members who are here with us today. Sanjeev Kaul and Bill Bowling from Film Sites International. If you could please stand, we'd like to welcome you. City Club's Legacy Society ensures the long-term financial stability of the club by increasing our endowments over time. If you have the capacity to do so, please consider becoming one of those generous members who are planning for the club's future. For more information, you can see City Club's Executive Director, Charity Fain, after the forum. I'd like to thank our media partners, including Oregon Business Magazine, and I'd also like to offer our appreciation to the Friday Forum corporate sponsors whose generous financial support makes these forums possible. Please join me in offering our sincere appreciation to this quarter's sponsors: communications firm Morel Inc., utility company Northwest Natural, and the law firms of Perkins Coie and Schwabe Williamson and Wyatt. We are very grateful for your support. If your company or firm would like to be a City Club sponsor, please contact the City Club staff at the back of the room or call the City Club offices. Today we're going to be experimenting with something a little different during our question and answer period. On each table are pens and index cards. During the forum, we invite you to write any questions that you have for our speaker on these cards. You do not need to be a City Club member to submit a question. Then during the board host question, City Club staff will collect the cards, pick the best question, and read it from the microphone. City Club members are still welcome to come to the microphone to ask their questions during the Q&A, and we're sure you're going to come up with some great questions for today's speaker. And now to our program. Oregonians are notoriously anti-sales tax, but at what cost? State services such as public safety and education must rely heavily on property taxes and volatile income taxes. With the recent economic downturn, this has required massive service cuts to keep the state budget balanced. Today, our speaker will explore how Oregon might ensure stable and adequate revenue through innovative ideas and strategic thinking. She'll identify the problems with our current revenue system, including the issues inherent in populist budgeting via an initiative and referendum system. She will discuss creative alternatives to Oregon's heavy reliance on property and income taxes, and will address what government could potentially achieve if we changed some of our underlying assumptions. Before stepping down only a month ago, Elizabeth Harchenko served for nearly 15 years as director of the Oregon Department of Revenue. As director, her responsibilities included administering state, personal, and corporate income taxes, tobacco taxes, and inheritance taxes, and supervising the property tax system. Prior to her appointment at Revenue, she worked as special counsel to 2 attorney generals, where she was a key advisor on revenue, tribal gaming, retirement, ethics, and legislative issues. She served as chair of the Multi-State Tax Commission, a national organization dedicated to uniformity and consistency in state tax administration, and is past president of the Western States Association of Tax Administrators. And now please help me welcome today's speaker, Elizabeth Harchenko.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Sharon, very much. First, As you would expect from any government or former government employee, comes the disclaimer. As you've heard from the introduction, I've recently retired from state government. I am going to have to use my glasses. I'm trained as a lawyer, and my work has been in the field of state and local taxation. I do not represent the governor, the legislature, or the courts. Today I'm speaking as a private citizen, I'm still getting used to that label, who has had the privilege to work in all three branches of state government over the course of my career. My comments today are my personal opinions and observations based on my own experiences in public service. And what I do know from that time is that any one person, even with a long duration of experience, usually has a fairly narrow focus. And so my experiences may be different from those of others. One of the things that I am very joyful about today is that as I came in, the first person who greeted me was Fred Neal, whom I have known for 35 years. We started out together working for the legislature when we were law students. So I'm so grateful to have that friendly face among so many today. When I was first invited to come and talk, I spoke with Marge Kafori. And she said, we'd like you to come and talk about stable and adequate revenue. And we immediately got into a discussion, a very energetic one, about whether you could talk about stable and adequate revenue without talking about government services. How much? How many services? What services? How are they delivered? And I made what I thought was a fairly persuasive argument to Marge that you can't talk about the one without the other. So she came back later and said, well, why don't you just come talk about both of them? So I'm actually here, I believe, to talk about both change in the delivery of service as well as the funding. And so I posed two questions for the course of this conversation, and I will try to address both of them. I don't have perfect answers. The first is, in order to talk about how much money you need to fund public services, you have to ask, what services do you want, and how do you want them delivered? And the second question is, how broadly do you want to spread the cost of those services across the community that has asked for them or that uses them? And so that's what I'm going to be talking about today, and weaving into that the revenue situation in Oregon, the funding streams that we use, the challenges and constraints on those funding streams, and I hope make some useful suggestions for how to deal with the challenges. So another thing that I talked to Marge about, and that I think she agreed with, is that this is not a new conversation. This is one that, at least in my experience, has been going on for about 30 years in bits and pieces, in fits and starts, each time the state has gone through an economic slump. In the past, what we've done is weather the storm. We've made short-term budget cuts or turned to one-time funding sources in order to get by. We've had 2 studies of our tax system, at least in the time that I've been in state government, and found it lacking in both attempts, but we haven't significantly changed it. We've continued to experience the boom and bust cycle of revenue growth and recession, and of program expansion in good times and program cuts in bad times. So what is it about now that makes it different? Why do we need to have this conversation seriously? Because I believe it is urgent that we have this conversation seriously and not just pick it up and put it back down again when it begins to look like the economy is coming back. There's an old Chinese proverb that says, insanity is doing the same thing in the same way and expecting a different outcome. Many of us have, in state government particularly, I think, but also many of you, I'm sure, and in the private sector, have come to the conclusion that we simply cannot do the things that we have always done the way we've always done them, and expect our state not only to recover from this great recession, but to grow and thrive in the years to come. The reason is simple. The money to do what we have always done, the way we have always done it, simply is not there anymore. And it isn't going to be for quite some time. So we can no longer afford the cost of today's government. Now, I'm not giving you a new message. You heard this from Governor Kulongoski as he has addressed this group over time. It's been shared by his reset cabinet. Governor Kitzhaber also has acknowledged and is attempting to deal with this fact. But it's something that is easier to ignore than it is to acknowledge. I'd like to refer for a bit to Governor Kulongoski's Reset Cabinet report because I think it makes the case in the best possible way. Changes in our economy, changes in our society, and the growth of the costs in the big three service areas of state government, education, public safety, human services, have come together to create the reality of a decade of deficits in state government. Not just a risk, a reality. The Reset Cabinet found that there will be a substantial gap between tax revenue that can be expected over the next 10 years and the projected costs of core public services as a result. On the economic and revenue front, the Cabinet concluded that recovery from the recent recession will be much slower than in the past. The economic forecasts since the first Reset report, which was June last year, have reinforced this. And Oregon is not likely to regain the number of jobs that were lost from this recession until 2015. General fund tax revenues, which are predominantly provided by the individual income tax, are not projected to return to their 2008 level until sometime in 2016. The approval of Measures 66 and 67 last year have also made our income tax system on which we depend more volatile and unpredictable for the future. At the same time as the growth in revenues is slowing, the level of demand for services is growing because of changes in the demographics of our population. I was just talking to Sharon about a session that she attended on aging and the fact that the demographic changes in our society, the baby boom generation, how many here? Baby boom generation? Oh, yes. Is retiring, aging gracefully. We are all aging gracefully, right? Lots of self-care so that we can live a long and healthy life. But nevertheless, the baby boom is entering retirement. The elderly population is growing and living longer. Chronic unemployment creates and continues the need for more financial support for families in the form of food stamps, medical services, and cash assistance. And people of working age on whom we depend for our income tax revenues are becoming a smaller part of our population. Finally, the cost of delivering core services, education, public safety, health care, and other services for needy citizens is increasing beyond the capacity of our current revenue stream to fund them, at least in the current way that they are carried on. The Reset Cabinet cataloged the primary cost drivers: payroll cost increases, both wages and health benefits, retirement system cost increases, and inflation in the cost of goods and services. Taken together, these three components result in a projected shortfall to pay for what we've always done, the way we've always done it, of about 20% for each two-year budget cycle over the next 8 to 10 years. If this doesn't make the case that government needs to change, I don't know what does. Governor Kitzhaber's made fundamental change a central theme for his administration. He has called for change in the way we think about service delivery, what services government provides, and how we plan for the future. And I think he has recognized the reality that in the current public climate, we can't talk about changing the revenue structure and raising more revenue until we have addressed the public's distrust and lack of confidence in the way that we deliver services today. And that is the last significant factor in this discussion, is public expectations. It's clear that the public expects and should expect government to operate efficiently and effectively, to be accountable for public funds and how they are spent, and to be transparent and accessible. People see the private sector using technology to make goods and services available at the touch of a button or the click of a mouse. And they also see the effect of competition, keeping the cost of goods and services generally low, and forcing business to be efficient in order to attract customers. And they expect the same from their government. So this is why I believe we're having this conversation today. We need different outcomes. We won't get them unless we consider fundamental change. So I want to address now for a bit, what services do we want? I'm not an economist, I'm not a political scientist, I'm a lawyer, which should, that's automatically a handicap. But even a lawyer can tell you there are as many different opinions about what services should be provided by or through government as there are people. The variety is as broad as our political spectrum. Some want government to assure that social or economic behavior is regulated so that if someone could be hurt economically or otherwise, that won't happen. Some want to assure there's an extensive safety net for those who can't provide for themselves. Others want government to provide only basic services that support a healthy private sector, and that people should take more responsibility for protecting and supporting themselves. Pretty broad spectrum. The philosophical debates predate my birth, and I'm sure they will postdate my death. However, many of us, I think, agree that the core services that government should provide usually fall in those big three areas: education, public safety, and social services. And in those categories, there is also tremendous diversity of opinion. Let me just give you a sample of the variety of things that come under those three very simple headings. Education, early childhood, K-12, higher education, vocational education, services for special needs children, testing, building and maintaining schools, athletics, enrichment programs for talented and gifted children, licensing and regulation of teachers. This is just a few of the activities that come under that chunk of the state's education budget. Public safety, state prisons, parole and probation supervision, local jails, the court system, district attorneys, the state police, the military department, emergency planning and security, violent youth custody and supervision, and health care for inmates. Again, just a few of the activities that come under public safety. Human services, oh my gosh. This is a tremendous potpourri of services and activities. Everything that has to do with health care now is being collected and gathered under the new Oregon Health Authority. And that includes administration of Medicaid, mental health services, addiction services, long-term care, and it will also include health services and health care coverage for people in public service. The other side of human services, cash assistance for families and low-income adults, child protective services, services for the elderly and people with disabilities, vocational rehabilitation, public health, vital records, and the list goes on and on. And within each of these subcategories, there are still hundreds more specialized services and activities, and the systems that are needed to support them. And this is one of the things that I've sort of been on a high horse about in the last several years of my work. The support systems are as essential to delivery of service as the delivery of service itself. It's a hard argument to make. Computer technology, financial planning, accounting, good business management practices, risk identification and management, these are all things that are not the direct service delivery. It's not the teacher in the classroom. It's not the revenue agent on the phone collecting taxes. It's not the corrections officer making sure that prisoners are behaving themselves. But without that infrastructure, that work really is not most effectively done. At this point, I need to remind you again of my disclaimer. The opinions that I share are my own. The examples I use are not to suggest that any particular program or policy is good or bad, or right or wrong, but simply to illustrate how we have gotten to where we are and the challenges we face in trying to change and come to some agreement on what services government should provide and how they are delivered. Outside those big three, we also have program areas that touch everything from agriculture to air quality, land use to licensing, and taxation to tourism. In my observation, the number and range of government activities seems to have mushroomed over the past several decades. The creation, funding, and implementation of new programs or services usually follow similar paths. Someone, a legislator, a constituent, a stakeholder, an interest group, identifies a problem or a need and concludes there ought to be a law. Because that's the only tool the legislature's got, is enacting laws. With sufficient support or lack of opposition, the problem is solved or the need is met with a new government program. Typically, there's no standard set of questions asked about the potential impact, long-term cost, or long-term expected benefit for the new program. It's simply, there's a bug, squash it. Very short-term thinking, in my view. Also, it's rare that there is subsequent legislative review of whether the problem truly was as described, it's been solved, or the need has been met, or whether the circumstances have changed sufficiently that we don't need to do that anymore. And as a result, what we have is growth of government programs, because we have a problem, we solve the problem, and then the underlying assumption is the problem always exists the way that it existed in the first place, and the solution is always the same. Let me give you an example of this one. Fred, you'll remember this one. In the late 1970s, the legislature tried to evaluate the need for the many licensing boards that had proliferated over the years. They set a sunset review committee and called somebody from each of the licensing boards in front of the legislature to justify their existence. Apparently, most of them were successful. I went back and checked. Only the Watchmakers Board and the Auctioneers Board were eliminated. Scroll forward, 2009 Legislative Assembly. I was sitting in the Ways and Means Committee waiting for hearing on the Revenue Department budget, and there was a bill that had been referred to this committee that was being heard first. It was House Bill 3127. It established a new licensing program for locksmiths. The problem was that the reported problem was that consumers were being victimized by unscrupulous locksmiths who were either overcharging for services or damaging property because they were not competent. Testimony was provided by a locksmith. A new licensing program was established. Estimated cost, $400,000, assigned to the Construction Contractors Board, which was already overwhelmed with fly-by-night builders. And they were required to administer a new testing and licensing program. The estimated number of locksmiths in the state, about 2,000. No enforcement money provided, no sunset review, no questions about, do we really need this? Could we spend this money better elsewhere? Bill approved unanimously in committee, large majorities on both floors. If typical behavior occurs, unless there is another sunset review, in the future, the program may be criticized during budget hearings when the Contractors Board is coming before the legislature as costing too much and doing too little, but the program will not be repealed. Presumably, locksmiths will be licensed forever until there are no more locks. And I know this sounds cynical, but it is the modus operandi that legislators are used to. And I know we have a former legislator here, Mr. McPherson, so forgive me, but I think I see a smile of acknowledgement. Another common occurrence is a program will be started and then there will be tinkering and tweaking over the years, and this one is one of my own pet peeves. In 1989, the legislature enacted a charitable checkoff program. A taxpayer is allowed to designate on their income tax form that a portion of their tax refund can be paid directly to a qualifying charity. When the program was set up, a board was established to determine which charities could actually have their name on the front of the tax form. And there was a lot of jockeying and jostling in order for people to get their charities on the front of the tax form, because people often didn't look at the instructions to see the other 40 that were also eligible for checkoff. And then charities that couldn't get on the front page of the tax form because there wasn't room started going to legislators. I remember at least 3 legislative sessions where members called me and said, well, if you squeeze these lines together, you could fit one more charity on the front of the form. What's the purpose of the form, folks? Reporting tax liability. And yet, focus, tinker with this other. So we have a lot of tails wagging the dogs. To me, it's not surprising that state and local government programs have extended as far as they have. Our political system supports this result. A cynical person might suggest that our political system assures it. People who stand for election usually do so in order to do good things. What is good is usually determined by the candidate's political philosophy or life experience, and what is good may also be defined in part by the interests of those who support them financially. If a successful candidate wants to continue to be successful, that person usually needs to demonstrate what he or she has accomplished once elected to office. Accomplishments are usually measured by how many new laws or programs you created, not by how many old laws or programs you eliminated. So, accretion of programs, political process, I'm watching my time. Let's move to how government services ought to be delivered, because this is the area where we really need to make some change. The other thing that's happened over the years is rules, procedures, processes have been set in law that agencies need to follow. And where policy needs to be clear, that shouldn't be a problem. Tax policy, from my perspective, does need to be decided directly by the representatives of the public, not here, Revenue Department, go raise revenue and figure out who should be taxed and how much and whether mortgage interest ought to be exempted. I'm not talking about that. But what I am talking about is the prescriptive way in which our law has developed that says this is how you need to do this work. Much of the how instruction for state tax administration was drafted in the 1970s. There's been no comprehensive overhaul of that, bits and pieces of fixes here and there, but still requirements for service by mail when electronic communications are much more effective, and other just process requirements that create inefficiency, slow us down, and actually, I think, help support the risk of errors. So decisions about how to deliver the services necessarily are going to involve questions about who best can achieve the results. And here's another area of great debate. Should government directly provide a service through public employees? Should government supervise the delivery of a service by contracting with third parties from the private sector to do so? We have great examples of success in those areas. Roads and bridges are built by people in the private construction industry. Contracts administered obviously by the Transportation Department, but they don't hire people who go out directly, public employees, who build things anymore. Another, of course, is healthcare. I don't think state government could ever be large enough to deliver all the healthcare services that it pays for. And so it depends on hospitals, doctors, other medical providers to deliver those services. So in any case, there's no automatic right answer for who should provide, how the services should be provided, and who should provide them. So I think I'm talking too long about all this and I need to move on. Disclaimer again, I'm kind of on my soapbox about how services are delivered and what I see are the constraints. One example of the business requirements the legislature imposes on state agencies with good reason, and it can create problems, are purchasing laws. They were enacted to assure fair bidding processes, equal opportunity for potential contractors, and best value for public funds. But the rules have gotten so detailed, there's so much paperwork, there's so much time for process steps, that especially for a pure procurement like a technology procurement, where the life cycle of the work that you're trying to do can be outstripped by the time it takes to do the process, hampers government's ability to be responsive to citizens. Another area where things are a constraint for us to be able to respond to the expectations of the public are our system of job classification. It's rule-bound, it's a constraint. What it tells employees is, thou shalt not do anything outside your position description, even if you have the skills to do it. What it tells managers is, you really are going to have a hard time developing employees and using their skills where you need them the most, because you have to fit people into little slots based on position descriptions. It's something that has been recognized in state government for a number of years. It will require significant investment in order to fix it, and it's competing with funds for teachers and funds for health care in the current budget debate. So government is set up with rules, set up to follow rules, and rules do slow us down. The really important thing I think I want to make sure that you hear from me is that people in government, employees, the managers, who are in the administrative end of the work, know that we need to change. We know that we need to streamline our processes, we need to eliminate waste, we need to cut down on making errors, and we need to make sure that we're delivering value with the very, very precious public resources that we're given to work with. The Department of Revenue, as an example, has set as its mission statement that the purpose of the agency is to make tax systems work to fund the services that improve the quality of life for all citizens. And it's a very lofty statement of our objective, but that really is why we exist, is to take those clunky old systems and make them work as best we can so that the revenue that is supposed to be coming in does, and it funds those services that we're talking about, that the public, you legislators as your representatives, decide are the services that government should be providing. Once that revenue comes in, however, it goes through quite a sifter. And the issues that I've seen, I've worked with Mayor Doyle here from Beaverton on a group called the Government Efficiency Task Force over the last interim, where we looked at ways that services that are common or shared between state and local government perhaps could be more efficiently delivered. One of the questions that I raised, and I'm sure that it's probably good that I've retired because it's an incendiary one, is why do we still have 36 counties? The folks at the Association of Oregon Counties told us that the history was the county lines were laid out when travel was by horse, and that everyone should be able to reach the county seat because that was where all of the public's business was done, in no more than a half day's ride. Anybody here still traveling by horse? And you can, of course, you can now watch what your local government does on television, on the internet, through streaming video. You can participate electronically, telephonically, by mail. You can get there, of course, by car or public transit, but you don't need a horse. And it doesn't take that long. And yet we have 36 separate duplicate infrastructures in the counties to provide those core services the legislature has delegated out to be delivered in community by the counties. If we don't start asking questions at that fundamental level, why do we have this many? Why do we do this? Why do we do this way? We are not going to get out of the cost side of the mire that we're in. So those questions are hard to ask. They're even harder to get people to take seriously because of all of the entrenchment that we've created over the years in elected officials who have been vested with a responsibility that they want to discharge to the constituents who elected them. There are some counties that are at risk of actually being unable to function financially because federal funds that they've been dependent on for years are going to dry up in another year and a half. And there's not really an answer yet that's been developed for what are we going to do when Curry County no longer has the resources to provide a jail. Because that's a reality that Curry County is facing. What's going to happen when some of the Northeast Oregon counties' road funds dry up and they're not able to maintain county roads for their citizens? These are real challenges that we face as a community today. So we have systems that are old, that were created at a time when life was slower, there was less that needed to be done, the pace of change was manageable, and resources were more stable. And now we are We are experiencing change at the speed of light, and we still are trying to function in pretty dysfunctional old systems in order to get the work done. So I think the other thing I want to talk about that's related to this issue is the resistance, the natural resistance to change that we experience that's embedded in our decision-making systems. Once again, disclaimer, I'm a former executive branch administrator, so my experience with the state budget process is one of 3 years ahead of time, start gathering and crunching a huge amount of numbers, turn in 25 binders of a ream of paper each that slice and dice my budget by FTE, positions, cost centers, but not by program, and turn those in, have those reviewed by budget analysts in the legislature and actually in the governor's office in the legislature, and then go, and I have about 6 hours to talk about the work of the Department of Revenue with a legislative committee. The big decision about how much money is going to be appropriated to my department from the general fund is made by a small number of people, none of whom are in that room. And because they're the only ones apparently who have the ability to balance all these competing interests. And then I will be told that my budget is to reflect what I'm going to spend over the next 2-year period. This makes no sense to me. My budget has to balance to the penny for a 24-month period based on a revenue estimate that changes every 3 months. And this is driven in part, I think, by the fact that the legislature has to balance the budget, and they have to balance it to something. But my experience of budgets in my own personal life is that I try to anticipate what I'm going to need in big categories and in sort of big blocks of dollars, and then make sure that I'm going to have roughly that amount of money available. But I don't budget for the number of quarts of milk I'm going to drink over a year, and yet there are things in state budgets that are that precise, and I think that's got to change because it doesn't work. Another thing that is a problem that we've got to deal with in order to change services is how we think about change itself. In the legislative process, especially if we start talking about technology and the need to upgrade systems, the first reaction is, no, we don't want to do that. 1, it's expensive. It is very expensive. 2, it takes a long time, longer than 2 years. 3, there have been some spectacular failures over the years. The one that comes most frequently to people's lips is motor vehicles, which was, I think, almost 30 years ago now. And as if we haven't learned anything about how to plan for complex systems changes. We are going to have to begin to do those things together. Planning, learning from the private sector about how to manage change, planning what we're going to do, being clear about what we expect, implementing a plan, doing it in bite-sized increments so that we're not getting ahead of ourselves or doing too much, check what we've done, and then adjusting based on what we learn from that check. But it requires learning, and it requires accepting the possibility that whatever you do isn't going to be perfect right out of the box. And that's another assumption that I think has to be questioned and challenged by the legislature and by those in state government leadership, is that if you make a change, it may not be perfect right out of the box, and that has to be okay. Right now, the messages are it's not, because somebody will either say you failed, even if you succeeded 95%, or there will be something in the news that agency tried to do this and wasn't successful, or there will be legislators who say, I remember 20 years ago something happened and it was awful, or we tried that and it didn't work then, and so we're not going to do it today. Change is hard, change is scary, and change is what we have to go through. Risk tolerance, I think, is at the root of all of this. And I think our political system doesn't allow for very much risk tolerance. I need to get into the financial, because I think that's something that is really important to this group for me to talk about. And then I would encourage you to ask questions about the other stuff if they occur to you. Oregon has a mix of broad-based and narrow funding sources for public services. Our broad-based taxes are like our personal income tax, which every citizen that has income over about $3,000 a year has to file and report and pay liability on their net income. Corporate income taxes. The property tax is the big, broad tax at the local level. We also have taxes on tobacco and alcohol, and depending on what year it is and how good the economy is, tobacco taxes may bring in more than the corporate income tax, either that or their third. And then we have some taxes where the revenue has been targeted a little more narrowly to an activity, like fuel taxes. So taxes on gasoline are used only for roads and bridges. Taxes that are received, collected through the 911 or the telephone service system are used to fund emergency communications. And those are tied then to specific government services, but they're collected broadly from users of big systems like roads and telecommunications. We also have fees for service, tuition, utility payments, where someone who wants to use a service has to pay in order to get it. We also rely pretty heavily on other sources of funding like the lottery, although it is not anywhere near as big as the personal income tax, despite the advertising that you see. Federal funds and borrowing. Economists have identified a number of qualities or characteristics of an effective tax system. Adequate and stable, which of course was the original conversation Marge and I were having. Fairness, efficiency, economic neutrality, and transparency. Adequacy and stability are related to the ability to raise necessary funds both for the present and the future. In other words, an adequate and stable base is one that's likely to be able to grow commensurate with the growth in demand for service. A stable revenue stream is one that remains relatively constant even during short-run economic changes. So our income tax is a good example of adequate. It grows, it has, at least in the past, grown pretty consistently with the demand for services. But our income tax is volatile in the short term. As the economy increases and decreases, you get tremendous rates of growth or rates of decline in the income tax stream. The property tax, on the other hand, is one that's very stable and predictable, especially with the limits that have been imposed under Measure 5 and Measure 50. It does not grow, I'm sure Mayor Doyle will agree with me, commensurate with the need for services, especially in a growing community. So you see that's the contrast between the adequate and the stable. Many people have argued for years that sales taxes are a pretty stable source of revenue, and our neighbors to the north have seen that, and the adequacy issue, I think, has been a real one now in Washington State, and with this particular economic downturn affecting retail and consumer behavior, even sales taxes have suffered. Fairness is measured in a couple of different ways. One is ability to pay, or what we call vertical equity, and that would be a tax that is either at a flat rate or graduated rate so that those who have a greater ability to pay more. Regressive would be those who have less ability to pay more. Sales taxes have often been labeled as regressive. And then fairness also in the link between the burdens and the benefits. Those who pay more use more services. And then horizontal fairness, similarly situated taxpayers pay similar amounts of tax. Efficiency is the one that's nearest and dearest to my heart, easy to administer, easy to comply with. Income tax, very hard to administer, hard to comply with. Property tax, easy to comply with, harder and harder to administer now because of the constraints from the ballot measures. Economic neutrality taxes that disturb market decisions the least. Our policymakers from the federal level and the state level often use the tax system to achieve economic goals or social goals, and so there's more economic disturbance of the force in the income tax. Finally, transparency. Tax incidence is obvious, is something that's important to pay attention to. Does the public understand, both individually, how much they pay and where it goes, and how much generally is paid and where it goes? I think with our distribution, particularly of taxes that support education, we've shifted to about 2/3 of that support for local education coming from the state general fund, income taxes from everybody. And there's very little connection anymore between what I pay as a citizen and a resident of Salem-Keizer District 24J and the amount of revenue, the amount of money that is used by that district in order to provide services. The shift from Measure 5 was from about a 40% state contribution and 60% property tax to almost 2/3 state and 1/3 property tax. So our system measures up well in some areas and not so well in others. Our income tax was doing just fine. I think there are two things that have undermined the adequacy of the income tax as a long-term revenue source. One is the shift of funding for local schools to the general fund from the property tax, and the growth in demand for health services and the cost of those health services increasing faster than the rate of general inflation. I've already mentioned the income tax is unstable and probably more unstable for us, and let me give you one example. Oregon's personal income tax revenues are volatile at the top end because of the quantity of revenue that we depend upon that's paid because of capital gains and other investment earnings. Between 2008 and 2009, the quantity of capital gains reported and tax paid on dropped by almost 50%. And dividends and interest dropped by 25%. Now the biggest base, of course, is wages. But when we talk about being in deficit by several hundred millions of dollars, that really goes to our dependence for that component of the income stream for the income tax. What do I have, 3 minutes? Okay. So one other thing I want to talk to you about that I think you need to keep in mind if you're talking about and thinking about adequacy of our revenue system, stability of our revenue system, is that other use. Typically the revenue system, again, tax administrator talking, is to raise revenue to fund public services. Often what happens with our system is tax benefits are used as a way to induce social or economic behavior. And what those are called tax expenditures, and the governor's responsible for preparing a report about tax expenditures. It's prepared primarily by the research section at the Department of Revenue. It's posted on our website. It is fascinating reading. You don't have to go through all the federal stuff that we automatically pick up, but when you get into Oregon, there are over 60 specific Oregon subtractions from the income base or credits against the tax liability for social, economic, educational, and other objectives. And every time a tax expenditure is enacted, two things happen. It's an appropriation of funds, because it's a reduction of the revenue stream, that's dedicated to a very specific outcome or objective. And it never goes through the budget process. It rarely goes through legislative review, and to repeal it now requires a 3/5 majority in each house of the legislature. There is a committee that is reviewing tax expenditures, supposedly, this session, because during the 07 or 09 session, the legislature actually passed a sunset bill for some of the credits. But this is a really difficult area, because when a new idea comes that's wonderful and beautiful and shiny and bright, like the business energy tax credit, and it looks like it's going to be this big, and then it grows to be this big, and legislators are wanting to know what happened, and the economists are saying, well, these are the assumptions we made when we estimated it was only going to be this big, and then there are no controls. So I knew as I was writing this that I probably needed 40 hours to talk to you as opposed to 40 minutes. But let me just, for 1 minute, talk about what I think we need to do. I absolutely agree with the governor that we need a vision for the state, we need general consensus around that vision, and we need commitment to implementing it. And so what I would ask of this group, the governor needs your support, vocal support for the hard work and the hard decisions that he is prepared to make. Legislators need your support. They need your understanding. They have a horribly difficult job, especially this session, because all the decisions that they're making are going to hurt somebody and hurt somebody deeply. People they care about, people that they campaigned to take care of when they were elected. They need your support and understanding that these decisions are necessary. Public employees need your support. They care deeply about the work that they do, the people they serve, the programs that they carry on, and they know where they're broken. The problem is when you wave your hand and say this is broken and it needs to be fixed, sometimes that's a risky thing to do. And so a lot of folks just kind of hunker down and keep working. So encourage risk-taking, encourage change, get engaged, help make decisions about what services are essential. Try to help with the balance of what is the greatest benefit for the most people, and we should be able to get through this. So I'll stop. There's my friend Fred masquerading as Barn Bella.
Before I introduce our Friday Forum host today, if you have written a question on one of the index cards at your table, hold them up in the air right now and one of the City Club staffers will come by and grab them. The first question for our speaker, as always, will be from our Friday Forum host, City Club member Fred Neal. And Fred, why don't you come on up and take a crack at the first question?
Well, Elizabeth pointed out that we are longtime friends, and I have to disclaimer, Barnes Ellis wasn't able to attend today, and he would have otherwise asked this question, and I think it's a great coincidence that I get to lob this one at you, Elizabeth. Thank you for sharing the accumulated wisdom of your many years of state service, for which we are all very grateful. But welcome to the candor of the private sector of being a private citizen. And I'm going to call upon it. You've talked about the cost centers and the inefficiencies in the administration of state government. You've talked about the inefficiencies of the legislative process. But let's talk about the inefficiency of the voter-initiated legislative process. I've watched you in your career struggle to implement Measure 5, struggle to implement the kicker, corporate and personal. Are those efficient laws, and shouldn't they perhaps be repealed?
You get to stay up here and help me with this one.
You're on your own.
Oh, okay. So, disclaimer, private citizen, Measure 5, Measure 50 kicker, right? Okay. Just to recap, Measure 5, Measure 50 limited the property tax system. Measure 5 limited the amount of tax that could be imposed on any property to no more than 1.5% of its value. There were some school districts whose tax rates were way over that. And so the offset in Measure 5 was that the state was to make up lost property taxes to schools, phased in from 1991 to 1996. But that obligation expired in 1997, although the legislature has tried valiantly to carry forward. Measure 50 limited the growth of assessed value so that values can, rolled them back for 2 years from the time it was enacted, and then limited the growth to 3% a year. So we've disconnected our property tax from the fairness indicator, which was real market value, and limited its growth pretty significantly so that as a resource for local government, it's less and less adequate. Measure 5 and Measure 50 make property tax administration very difficult. They make understanding the system difficult for taxpayers. So if I were grading Measure 5 and Measure 50 on the basis of those factors of a good tax system, I would say it's somewhere between a D and an F. The reasons behind Measure 5 and Measure 50 were perceptions about the fairness and the burdensome nature of the property tax on individual homeowners. Property values in Oregon were rising dramatically in the 90s, and people were being perceived as being taxed out of their homes. So, so from the tax administrator standpoint, the property tax would be simpler, more responsive, more adequate if we step back and retooled. There are other things about the property tax system I would change too if I were queen. Fortunately, I'm not. Kicker was your other one. So the kicker is the penalty that is paid when the state economist isn't perfect. Now, I love Tom Potowski. He is a really, really bright guy. And he acknowledges that an economist, no matter how hard they try, because of the nature of the assumptions they have to make about predicting how much money is going to come in the future, can't get it right. The standard is very high. If they're off by 2%, the excess goes back. Theory, if you didn't plan on it, you don't need it. But we sent out more than $1 billion in kicker in November 2007. If that money had been saved, and that's a big if because the legislature did have a habit of spending everything that it had to spend, if that money had been saved in some sort of a reserve account, it might have been usable to buffer some of the problems, the economic downturn that we've been experiencing. So the kicker does probably need some change if we're going to have a more stable system.
As always, we're now going to take questions from the floor. This will include at least one of the index card questions. Maybe. With this exception, asking questions at Friday forums is a privilege of City Club membership. Before asking your question, please identify yourself as a club member and ask your questions in 30 seconds or less. If I flash my question mark card, it means that we have not heard the question yet and we'd like to.
Lee Stevenson Kuhn, City Club member. What legal changes need to happen to implement user fees?
Legal changes to implement. Can I get some clarification about what you mean by user fees?
Well, I'm a transportation junkie, so I'm thinking about fees on users of vehicles and how they use roads, and also congestion pricing at rush hour times and tolls and those kinds of fees.
Okay, I understand.
Yeah.
I understand. The authority for the state to levy fees and charges and taxes is vested in the legislature, unless it's limited in the Constitution. I'm not aware that there's a limitation in the Constitution against the legislature imposing those kinds of fees at the state level or authorizing local government through statute to use them at the local level. So the legal changes would have to be statutory.
So Charity Fain, I'm the executive director of City Club, and I'm asking a question that was written in from the floor. If Oregon were to finally add a retail sales tax to its revenue mix, how long would it take to put in place the system for collecting it, and what proportion of the receipts would be spent in the first budget year doing so?
Whew. Okay, I can answer part of that question, but not all of it. We looked a couple of times at what kind of work it would take to implement a general retail sales tax. We have the benefit of the experience of 45 other states that we could learn from. We would not be inventing a new wheel. Also, the states that do have sales tax have worked very hard on a streamlined model that that state of Oregon would be able to use. And we estimated that it would take about a new division of the department, 100 to 150 people. So you're hiring, training, And then you've got to be in touch with those who have to collect and remit the sales tax. And the education of that community that has to collect and remit is where the time and the challenge would occur. So our thought was sales taxes would begin to come in shortly after the imposition of the tax was prescribed by law, like within 6 months, and it would be a ramp up. Big retailers that are national, that are experienced in collecting sales tax would have much less difficulty than Oregon-only businesses that have never had to collect it before. And I don't have in my mind and don't want to speculate how much, what proportion might come in for expenditure in any particular period of time. That would depend on resources, how quickly they were given, when the tax was actually required to be collected, and the mechanisms available to do so. Okay.
It seems to be, my name's David DeMarchi, I'm a City Club member. It seems to be a given that if there's going to be a sales tax in Oregon, it needs to be revenue neutral. What, in your opinion, would a revenue neutral sales tax actually do for solving our budget problems?
If any tax change that is revenue neutral, whether it is an addition of a new tax, a modification of the existing system, is based on the premise that it would bring in the same amount of funds. It would distribute the cost of government differently. So revenue neutral doesn't raise more money. It collects it differently. Revenue increases are what are necessary to increase the amount of dollars that come in. Cost reduction, efficiency, and change in program mix are what are necessary to reduce the costs so that the revenue that you have is adequate.
We have run out of time for further questions and we'll have to stop for the day. Join us next week for a panel discussion on Oregon's nursery industry. And as we close, please join me in expressing our appreciation to today's guest, Elizabeth Harchenko. We're adjourned.